big break to support the Abbot. What the vehicle will do once that is in, the Abbot should travel over the top of that machine through the throttle. Okay, as I said, it's essentially what happens with Abbot and Abbot. Armoured engineer vehicle, what you have is the complexity of a tank combined with the complexity of the bigger frame. This is really more complicated than arms. They really have to do great to see these vehicles running, really impressive. S4, Chieftain Abbot, fast now, representative of the Chieftain Abbot. The bridge gets picked up now, getting pulled out. Gentle with it, the seals in it will be quite worn, but again, fair dues getting that vehicle working and running. The vehicle itself is on loan from the Tank Museum, and it really is good to see it being used. The vehicles degrade, and that's a big part of why the Tank Museum have loaned that vehicle to Joe, to see it used and see it do there.
As we've heard already, the Chieftain was a fairly unreliable vehicle. And
over to the right hand side of the arena and speak to the guys there. We also have representatives of the Army Reserve and Royal Engineers here. So again, if you want to talk to those guys, go have a chat with them and learn.
The Abbot was originally designed to take over the Second World War, and the idea being that in that turret, those range the shells will be fired. Now you can see it going past us at the moment. It's got its gun in a cradle. It would normally drive that in a lock. When it's ready to deploy, that gun will graze right up in the air. It can actually do a very high angle, and it can fire off about 6 to 8 rounds a minute, which is a fair old rate of fire, and the idea being that it's only got about 40 rounds it carries with it, but it will be followed along sometimes by a stalwart carrying more rounds to be able to replenish it in action. And the idea being mobile artillery, that Abbot, ecclesiastical position, so you've got sexton there, we had priest, we've got Abbot, there was something called deacon in World War II as well. But the idea being you get out of trouble quickly. That's part of the idea there. So you're not around, you don't hang around too long waiting for return artillery fire to come back and land on your position. Hence that need for good mobile artillery there. Abbot never fired its gun in anger. We never actually had to use it. Just like Chieftain never fired its gun in anger against an enemy. Chief family driving around. This, we've mentioned them already. Combat vehicle reconnaissance tracked. Sabre and scimitar with a 30mm Raden cannon put on the top there. And again, that 30mm Raden cannon is quite a powerful bit of kit. fire burst in about 3 rounds. Now, the whole CBRT family, it starts back in 1967. They start the first in the 70s. We sold it to the Belgians. We sold the license to Belgium. They actually made CBRT in Belgium as well. And there's still a lot of these out there. We had Striker, Spartan, which was the armoured personnel variant, Samaritan, which was the ambulance variant, Sultan, Samson, you had a command variant. So lots of different things put on that welded aluminium hull that they had out of service with the British Army. Only recently we've still got a couple of variants kicking around. One fires Starstreak, the missile system off the back there. But you can see it in the car. That was a wheeled equivalent because, again, as I mentioned earlier, there was times where sometimes in Britain we thought, do we want tracked armour for reconnaissance or do we want wheeled armour for reconnaissance? And sometimes they used both in service at the same time. I mentioned earlier psychological impact. That's why we didn't take tracked vehicles to Northern Ireland. But they were considered too warlike to be used in the Troubles. Only once in Northern Ireland did tracked vehicles go there, and that was when we took some Centurion Averies over there as part of something called Operation Motorman, where they were used to knock barriers out of the way and things like that. But on the streets of Britain, it felt like we'd gone a bit too far. I mentioned earlier, most of the CBRT family was powered by a Jaguar car engine, slightly altered from the famous E-Type Jaguar. It was about the only size engine with enough power they could get that fitted in the space in the front of the vehicle down the side of the driver. They were trying to keep the weight down, not just to make it air portable, but under the track of that vehicle, the ground pressure is actually less than the weight of a human foot. And famously in the Falklands campaign, when they took some of the Scorpions and CBRT family out to the Falklands, one of them parked on what they thought was ground. It actually turned out to be a frozen bog. And the vehicle, because its tracks spread the weight out so well, was absolutely fine sitting on the ice. It was only when the commander dropped off the side of the vehicle, he fell straight through the ice because the ground pressure beneath his feet was that much more. So it's how clever a track can be to lessen the weight of the vehicle going over the track. You've got basically raw metal touching the ground, not a rubber pad in between. And the danger is there with raw metal, hot daylight today, soft tarmac. You turn left or right with aggressive track, that will just rip up the soft road surface. Now we've been enjoined by a few other bits and pieces coming out. We've got a half track there towing a 17-pounder anti-tank gun and limber. And if you know all your anti-tank guns, Britain starts at World War II with a 2-pounder, about a 40mm size, the hole at the end of the barrel. Very, very effective anti-tank gun, best one in the world in 1940. Unfortunately, it doesn't fire much in the way of high explosive. We already in 1940 designed a new anti-tank gun, something called the 6-pounder. But again, because we France in 1940, Churchill told the factories to keep making what they were doing rather than stopping and retooling for a bigger gun. So we don't actually start really using the 6-pounder anti-tank gun until at least a year and a half later. We don't get it on the tank till 1942, even though we've already come up with it. One of the military's constant drives is commonality of spare parts. Can we use the same wheels on? Can we put the same fuel in? Can we end up using all the same types of things? There's a great benefit somewhere because it means a completely different set of spare parts, how you're going to keep that vehicle going into the future, and quite simply sometimes the military has bought a fleet of vehicles and not bought the spare parts, which means that they end up just cannibalising parts of their fleet as they get older to keep them going. And you can imagine in this day and age, if you've got a vehicle like the FB432, that first went into service with the British Army when the Beatles were in the charts in the 60s. So a lot of the companies that made things simply are not there anymore, so you've got to find someone who's happy to take on the task of remanufacturing spare parts. Which of course is a sensible thing to do, because what we don't want to see is somebody else drive over that and next minute we've got bits of metal flying in the air and all over the place. So recovery, keeping an eye on what's on the vehicle, and of course it was something important to the soldiers as well, because strapping stuff, we all like these as well. It's quite a narrow tank, and that's because it was going to have to drive up mountain roads and in Switzerland, and they weren't that wide, so they purposely kept the tank pretty narrow, and they also made sure as well that it got very sensitive steering, because you don't want to be going over the edge of a road here and there. Other vehicles we've got coming on, we've got here the Leopard. This is, again, it's a version of the Leopard tank hull, but on top an anti-aircraft system that's been put together there. It's done by the German military. We've got a Centurion drive-by that's retired from service, but interestingly, some of them have been taken out again because there's an interest they may have a very good anti-drone capability. So again, we're back to the same for certain weapon systems. They have a second life because the new threat comes along. Some Leopards have also been sent out all the way out to the they toted them those long Tom 155 artillery pieces, but also anti-aircraft guns as well. There was something the Americans had called Sky Sweeper, and they were towed behind these M8 tractors as well. Engines up the front, which is slightly different to some of the other high-speed tractors, where you can see the crews almost sit either side of the engine there. We got Leopards come back on, that German tank, if you were here earlier on, we talked about. First tank German military were allowed to build the new West German Army in 1955. NATO realises we're going to need the skills and the manpower of West Germany to help defend, so they reformed the British there. They used famous Wehrmacht officers from the Second World War to help reform their military. And they also used some of the tank designers from World War II to help come up with what becomes the Leopard tank. The Mark I Leopard, the Germans decide to go for speed and firepower. In the Second World War they tended to go for armour protection and firepower with their later tanks. This one very different, big MTU diesel, and they thought that the speed would be the better way of protecting themselves on the back. And the whopping American flag there is being flown from the M60 tank. The M60, part of an American series of tanks that are called the Patton family, named after the American general. And they start after World War II, starting a design process that doesn't actually get very far. The M47, then the M48 tank. The Americans basically, after World War II, have lost interest, and literally American World War II tanks are being taken off plinths to be sent out to fight in Korea. And that gets them, jump-starts their tank program again with the M47, the M48 tanks. And a later model, they look very similar. There's a lot of M60s still around. You've got them in service still with Turkey, with Greece. Some of them are Greeks been exporting some with holes cut in them that people weld back up the holes and put them on display again. And the M60 is yet again that British tank 105 gun, mounted up the sides of the vehicle, so it's got like a rounded or a V-shaped hull. What you don't want if you drive over a big mine is all the blast of the mine to be captured underneath the belly of your vehicle, because that could flip you over, which is not what you want. So it's got this rounded shape there. torsion bar suspension, which means twisted metal bars go across the floor of the vehicle, shock absorbers you can see on some of the road wheels there. Do much in the way of advancing the technology in any way, but they were made in big numbers. There's about 15,000 of those M60s were built during their production run. They stopped making them in about 1983. Now you can see how mobile those Leopards are. Relatively light tank compared to other NATO tanks in service, but a very powerful MTU diesel engine to keep it going. Now we've been joined in the arena by what a lot of these tanks we've been seeing we're going to go up against. The famous Soviet, this one's a T-72, and I think somewhere it goes for a T-54 or T-55 at some point. The Soviets never lost their interest in tanks, because you know all about the T-34. They made huge quantities of very well designed but simple tanks. It was supposed to be this monolithic communist country. There was still rivalries between the tank companies, and the two to be built if it was basically war was going to be declared. Somehow the manufacturers of the T-72 got around that, and by the early 1970s they're building, number one, it's low profile. The lower you are, the harder a target you are to hit. And they managed to do that with the T-72 by saying goodbye to the loader. In a tank, the loader is almost, for the first time with a T-64 tank, they do away with the loader. They put a carousel system, an automatic loading system, in the base of the turret, and an automatic rammer will ram the shell in, followed by the explosive charge that blasts the round out. Downside, it means the ammunition is much more exposed. They can't hide it in armoured bins like NATO tanks, quite often surrounded by a water jacket. And that's why, sadly, you could say for Soviet tank crews or anyone in a T-tank, if they are hit, they're much more likely to go up in flames because of the ammunition catching fire. Now the T-72 is driving around, you can see it's putting diesel onto its exhaust, and that creates that smoke screen. A lot of tanks have that capacity now, and it means you can basically cover yourself with a smoke screen, so you're harder for the enemy to pick up. To themselves, their build standard of the ones from the Soviet Union were higher. They've got much more sophisticated armour, composites. They wanted the radioactivity, but it's just a very, very dense metal, and that has got more chance to actually find a way of penetrating.
5, 4, 3, 2.
Well, that looks to me very clear winners there. The two in the front are the two Leopards. T-72. I can't see through the dust. What's going on over the back there? What do we got? We've got the PZ-68, the M60. I think this is only one heat. The issue about speed in a tank, you think they don't necessarily go together, but of course the faster you are in the tank on the battlefield, especially when you're leaping from what you probably do want to go to as fast as you can in a vehicle, and know how to get through the gears. The downside is, if you can imagine with something like a 60-ton tank, if you go around like that for too long, you are going to wear out your engine, your tracks, and your gearbox that much quicker. 3485, which was the famous wartime tank, but it's got that classic frying pan-shaped turret as an identifier there, most Soviet tanks. And they also, Soviet Union also gave the plans when they were friendly, there was something called the Sino-Soviet Pact. Talk about the engine a lot. In fact, Chieftain was a very successful tank in the sense it had by far the thickest armour than any of its contemporaries in NATO at the time, and in its service life it was up-armoured. When there was the opportunity at what the Soviet T-64 gun, 150mm gun, had done to similar vehicles to the Chieftain that we sold into the Middle East, there was a desire in Britain to thicken the armour. We were very conscious. The most precious thing about that tank is its crew. So British tank crews always go into action knowing they've probably got the tank with the best level of protection on it. So when the Russians came out with a bigger tank gun, on the T-64, we added more armour protection to the Chieftain. Side, a new way of looking at the enemy. Basically, you were looking at the heat signature of the enemy's tank, not through a telescope or periscope to look at it that way. And that also meant tanks, once they had togs added, that meant Chieftain would fire at night just as effectively as it could during the day. And that metal dart will smash its way through enemy armour, quite often all the way through one side and out the other, and it creates a vacuum behind it. So basically anything malleable that's left in the tank is sucked through the exit hole, and that means quite often the enemy crew disappears in a red mist out the other side. So they're pretty vicious things if you're hit by a thin round. And that dates back really, the first spars to World War II. They were built on German tanks. The idea being for the D-Day landings, they realised lots of landing craft, they're going to be pushing back off the beach once they've dropped off the troops. We're bound to have vehicles that end up getting stuck or maybe swamped. So they ended up putting a metal penthouse on the top of a Sherman tank for reaming. At least one would be a diver, so he could actually go underwater, fix tow ropes and recover ground vehicles. Second Centurion coming on there, we've got the armoured recovery vehicle, and these were basically Centurion earlier models that repurposed by building that cab on the top, and they carry a winch with them, and they ended up building quite a number of these. They were sold off as well, we sold about 50 of them to the Swiss. Other countries use them as well. A winch, basically it was an auxiliary engine they put in there, a Morris engine. Later on Rolls-Royce B18 engine put in there as well, so that could pull anything, enormous weight. Your winch, or you could do straight pulls with holly bones and tow ropes, etc. So the whole idea being you're under armour, someone would have to get out to hitch it to the broken down tank, but it means you can recover vehicles from on the battlefield. Pushing off landing craft, gathering ground vehicles. Unfortunately, two of them ended up getting stuck in boggy ground and ended up busting their spline shaft. So that they ended up having to be recovered themselves after. It's got a ground anchor. If you are going to tow you with your winch, you don't want the vehicle to move on its track. So that anchor would literally be dropped into the ground. Make sure it's got a good purchase, and it means that if you are winching a vehicle out of a stuck situation using block and tackle.